right around 1912 or 7:12 at night. And I want to talk about something that's sort of starting to, well, for the last couple of days, it's been transforming in the sort of actions around some of the protests and riots with respect that have been triggered by the George Floyd incident. And we will talk in a future video about whether or not institutional racism exists. We'll talk about police brutality. We will talk about the perceptions of both of those things. And, we'll get into it. If you want to get into it, we'll get into it. But that's not what I want to talk about today, because for right now, the most timely thing that I'm seeing happen is the evolution of what is being expected as a resolution to this situation. Now, because there's no out, right? Like, all humanity, when faced with chaos and violence and conflict, starts looking for a way to make it stop. So if you want, like, all conflicts eventually end, right? They end in some fashion. And you starting to see people grope for what the resolution is. And it's bringing out in a very, very public way what has been simmering under the surface from the left in particular at this moment in history, which is this sort of secular religion around self-flagellation, abasement, and original sin. So we're going to put this in context. Anytime you want to control a population, the most successful ways you do that in human history are to do the following things. You satisfy the following requirements. One, you set a condition for goodness that is literally unachievable. So, in the case of socialism, they redefine generosity and goodness and selfishness in such a way that to take any interest in your self improvement and to value your family and your children above the collective, which as a human being you will do, it's hardwired, you are a bad person. So the condition of goodness, i.e. to truly think of the collective more than you think of yourself or the people you love, is on any wide scale impossible, and thus every human being will fail your test for goodness. And then you remove from them any possibility of redemption. In the case of socialism, again, you will never achieve a state where in your heart of hearts and your thought of thoughts, when you're all alone in your bed at night, that you would not prefer that your children eat rather than your neighbor's children, for instance. So not only are you bad inherently, is there an original sin in you that you were born bad, but you can never be redeemed. You will always fail. And then the last thing is you externalize any judgment related to the first or second of those legs of that tripod. So you make it someone else who is to sit in judgment about whether or not you've gotten any better, any closer to redemption, that someone else holds the power to decide whether you are making progress or not. And that means that you grant to them the moral superiority of sitting in judgment of you, and you remove from yourself access to rational thought about the situation. In other words, to question that you were born evil simply proves that you're evil. To question anyone's judgment about whether or not you're evil simply proves that you are evil, again, because you're not blindly accepting the judgment of this outside authority. In the case of socialism, that's the party. In the case of intersectional politics and identity politics, The authority for who can decide whether you are good or bad goes to whoever has amassed the most squares in their oppression bingo card. And that's sort of the one wrinkle that identity politics has brought to this. Most of every other time it's been tried in human history, the judgers and the judgees, the winners and the losers, the evil and the good, were fixed by the system, right? So the party was good, the individual was evil, the king was good, the subjects were not royalty, so therefore you were born to be abased, and in any case where that is worked, for the most part before, it was a fixed thing. You were either in the good side or you were out. But intersectionality has brought with it essentially capitalism. It's brought market forces to bear on the wielding of moral authority. If you can somehow convince through marketing the people around you that you have another victim class on your name, you can instantaneously move closer to being one of the people who holds moral authority to judge everyone else. So you are rewarded for moving up in the system and amassing more and more and more of these victim points, i.e., if you want to acquire more power, you have to convince other people to at least pay lip service to the idea that you are powerless. Thus, all the power you wield, by definition, brings with it the illusion that you are wielding it from a position of weakness and that it is simply redress for ill, and that your wielding of that power can never be questioned. You can never be considered a tyrant because the power you wield comes with it the assumption that the only reason you're being granted that power is because you lack the ability to hold it, that it's inherently a gift. Thus, no one has anything to fear from you because you're only wielding the power they grant you. It's truly amazing. And in all these systems, what they've created, because humans, generally speaking, want to be good, if you can convince people of these things, what you have is a group of people who will work harder and harder to tear bigger and bigger chunks out of their soul and their sanity and their ability to function like a rational human being and sacrifice it to you more and more and more, trying to burn out of themselves the thing that cannot be burned out, which is the capacity for realizing that there's something wrong in this. And some of them, a large portion of them, will manage to flip that little switch in their brain that actually uses the pain and the self-abasement as their measure, their substitute for rational self-esteem. So the more they roll in the dirt, the more they wiggle like a worm, the more they signal to each other and their friends about how abased they are, the better they feel about themselves, because the only avenue to self-esteem they have is by being a bigger worm. You saw this in the past in movements of people who are like, we've made fun of it. There are Blackadder episodes that talk about people that are like, oh, well, when we're at home, when we're having dinner, we don't sit on cushions. Because, if God had wanted us to have cushions, then, he would have given us cushions. And somebody's like, oh, so you sit on what? And they're like, oh, we sit on bare wooden chairs. And then the next person around the table goes, oh, you have chairs. That's very interesting. At home, we stand. And somebody else is like, oh, to stand, I long for the days of standing. But, ever since I searched my soul, I realized that what was really I needed to do was sit on a wooden spike to remind myself of the suffering of Jesus. And you see this perverse rush to the bottom as a substitute for one-upmanship. People putting each other down in their joy for abasement. So between the true masochists, the people who have managed to break their own brain enough to actually feel pleasure in how much they are abused, I don't mean a fun way, you also have the people who will pretend to go along with the system as their way to achieve moral authority and power. So and that's just the victims. I'm just talking about the people who are the ones being told they're horrible. When you move over to the overlords, the people who are making the judgments, all the while screaming about how oppressed they are while they make the decisions for everybody else, you've truly created something special. And it is not new to the American left, with the exception of that one twist about bringing market forces into it. This is how you hold a population. This is how religions have held populations. This is how the Egyptians held the peasantry. Often it's because the emperor is chosen by God, so he's elevated above you mere mortals. It actually, honestly, does not tend to happen with ethnic domination, pure ethnic domination, because it's very, very hard to actually convince people that if you're rainbow striped, that inherently means you're better than if you're chocolate striped, or if you're, covered in sparkles, you're better than the people that are pearlescent. Inherently, you can convince yourselves of that and then use force to control the others. But you can't get them to really participate in it by destroying them on the basis of some innate trait. This is why it always fails. This is why it failed eventually to convince homosexuals that they were morally flawed, and so on and so forth. There's something about the human psyche that eventually rejects the premise inherently if it's physicality. It's why you've never seen long periods of history where, you've managed to convince everyone who was short that they should be tall, so the short people walked around on stilts. Yes, you'll get some portion of any population who will ape and mimic their oppressors in an attempt to curry favor or to twist their brain. Yes, you always get but to do it on a large scale, you need to twist it into some sort of morality play, which is why when you're doing it around race, you don't say you're bad because you're white. What you say is, because you're white and you live in a system of oppression, you have subconsciously internalized, though you will never notice it maybe, oppressive thoughts and feelings, and you are constantly the beneficiary of things you haven't earned. So from the moment you were born, you've been twisted into a being of evil that you yourself would not have been had you been born at another place and time. So it's not that white people can't be good. It's that white people in this society can never be good. And that's the carrot. That you're not condemning me just because I was born. You're condemning me, but it wasn't really my fault. And then I can externalize it. I can say, well, I would have been a good person. And I will prove that to you and me, and I will abase myself. And now we come to what I want to talk about why this is worth discussing. Because it fails. And it will fail. And it always fails. You go through a period where, yes, the victors dominate. You go through a period like where we're going through now, where you get people turning each other in to the overlords in an attempt to curry favor, where you get people staying quiet about their opinions. Because, again, remember, to dare to judge and to question, to judge yourself good or bad, and to question whether the rules is, again, to just simply prove that you're bad. But I want to talk about now this growing video we're seeing time after time after time of minorities encouraging white groups or individuals to kneel and beg their forgiveness. Is it funny in a trolling kind of way? Yeah, sure. Is there something about watching a bunch of white liberals, roll around in the dirt and cry their eyes out while they, beg for forgiveness? Yeah, there's something kind of funny about it. It's also terrifying. It's terrifying because I know what comes after this. Let's talk about systemic racism for 1 second. There is not a statistically significant overt white supremacist movement in America. There is not a socially acceptable white pride movement in America. You want to have another conversation about whether or not there's institutionalized under the radar racism? Fine, we'll talk about it. But you know and I know that there isn't a chance in hell that Wendy's or any place else would come out and start giving away free burgers for White Pride Month. It would never happen. But you take a group of people and you show them a stream of photos of their wives and daughters and children being forced to their knees under threat of violence. In a lot of cases it is. How long do you think that goes on before some significant portion of these people who were previously on your side or at least ambivalent go, no, that I am not going to accept that my job is to spend the rest of my days on my knees and tell my children that their job is to spend their whole lives under the yoke working for you because of their internalized sins and the sins of their fathers and their ancestors. You would not tolerate it. And I don't think, despite what you see from the left wing that's been indoctrinated, fattened like calves to be sacrificed on this particular altar, you're not going to get a large portion of the nation to go with it for long. And I think it's a mistake. It's not gonna work out well for anybody. It's gonna go bad. Now, again, these tactics are like the tactics that are used in ethnic oppression, but they're slightly different again because they don't, while the American slave owners in the South, what became the Democratic Party in the South, while they may have believed that they were morally superior and placed on earth to be, served by the other races, there's no indication that there was a significant percentage of the American black population, slave population at the time, that also believed in the moral superiority or even paid lip service to the moral and ethnic superiority of the slave owners. And in fact, that was the seed of its swift downfall, faster in America than in anywhere else in the world. And one of the reasons why America toppled it first was because both of those groups granted the final moral judgment on such things to God. And in externalizing that, it was impossible for the white Christian slave owner to take onto himself the absolute moral authority, because he was also a sinner in front of God. There's a reason why it's very hard for nations founded on Judeo-Christian ethics to to have held on to slavery in the long term. They just weren't ethically built for it. So the seeds of its destruction were sort of in place from the very beginning. And that was a deliberate function of the creation of the nation. But in any case, this mental superiority, this identity enslavement, as opposed to racial or ethnic enslavement, is more of why you see it happening in those sort of tyrannies around socialism, communism. You see it in China, you see it in North Korea. It is not, in fact, though it has some analogies, it is not how, for instance, Hitler maintained power. Though they were National Socialists, the socialism was reserved purely for the Germans, and they sort of cast out the races that they thought were inferior. And again, there's no indication that there was widespread Jewish belief in Germany that bought into the idea that the Germans were in fact a real arbiter on whether Jews were human beings or not. The Germans were capable of forcing the issue at gunpoint, but they never did manage to get the Jewish population to buy into it the way, for instance, China gets most of the population to buy mentally into the idea that the party is the arbiter of morality. So we can have another conversation about sort of the techniques by which ethnic populations have enslaved each other for all of time. But the tactics that are being used by the left are not, in fact, the same tactics that were used in the early days of America. It's much more akin to the tactics that were used in England, where the crown was the seat of both religious and bloodline authority, and that, you know, the sort of commoners were assumed to be on a morally lower plane. You saw it in China. You saw it in Japan, where, you know, sort of the samurai and the upper classes were believed to be touched by God in a way that allowed them to genuinely sit in judgment of the people below them. So none of that's to detract from the horrors of ethnic oppression. I just want to make the distinction between what you would think of as identity oppression, or what's morphed into identity oppression and ethnic oppression. They are different things, though there's a conversation to be had about where they overlap. In any case, I wanted to point that out. I want people to think about the idea of these things as a secular religion. They have all the tenets of that. There's original sin. There's the externalization of judgment and morality. And now we see the priesthood emerging, and the priesthood is the angry minority who's standing over you while you know, as these white liberals desperately seek someone to confess to, someone who would throw them even a crumb of forgiveness and acceptance. It's the end game. It is what the left has worked for since the late 50s and early 60s, when, you know, these ideas were deliberately transplanted here by the Soviet Union. And, you know, you're looking at the end game. If there's one thing that Donald Trump has done more than anything else, and we could argue the pros and cons of Trump in every other way, but he did force the left to spring the ambush. If anybody's ever planned and executed a military ambush, you know, you pre-position your forces and you expend all this effort getting them there. And if the enemy shows up early, or something threatens your end game, you have a choice. You have an instantaneous choice you have to make. You either launch the attack knowing it's imperfect, or you lose all the effort you did to pre-plan and pre-position your forces and your resources. And the election of Donald Trump absolutely brought us to an inflection point early. They really expected to have 4 years of Hillary to finish solidifying everything that they had put in place. And they chose to launch the attack with what they had. But instead of an overwhelming, paralyzing blow on a population that had, you know, over 4 years been voluntarily disarmed, and a whole bunch of regulation put in place, and free speech locked down on Twitter and Facebook, and no ability to communicate around the media, they have had to launch their attack with the Second Amendment in place, which means the last 5 days have seen a incredible upsurge in gun sales. So rather than the population being disarmed and made weaker, the population is responding by getting stronger. And rather than us being incapable of communicating with each other, we are capable of communicating with each other and talking about the censorship that otherwise would have slowly slid in. You know, if we're talking about the incorrect idea of boiling a frog slowly, Donald Trump came by and reached for the frog, and they had to turn the heat up all the way right away. And the frog knows it's boiling now. And how it's going to turn out, I can't tell you, because those ambushes are always about who can adapt and who can react to the changing situation faster. But we're in a better position to fight back now than we would have been before. Anyway, everyone on any side of this, with the exception of those people who are burning stuff and being violent, I hope you stay safe. I support your right to make your thoughts heard in every legal and quasi-legal fashion. I understand civil disobedience. I truly do. Heck, I even understand flat-out disobedience. But I simply disagree that we're in the circumstances where that's justified or necessary. I don't think the numbers bear it out. In any case, hit me up on Twitch. On Twitter at Herdwatching and Writing Herd. And hit me up on Parler as Herdwatching, Parler. All right, thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you soon.